Welcome to Bruce Hurwitz Presents Meet the Experts. I'm your host, Bruce Hurwitz of Hurwitz Strategic Staffing. You can find us on the web at hsstaffing.com. I hope you'll consider us for all your staffing, career counseling, and professional writing needs. I am delighted to be joined today by Dr. Ed Daube. We will be discussing emotions. Meet the Experts is sponsored by P&K CPAs. P&K is a full-service accounting firm. They provide accounting and consulting services to businesses ranging from startups to small and mid-cap companies to nonprofits, as well as high-net-worth individuals. Contact them today for a free consultation at info@pk-cpas.com or call them at 973-882-8810. They will be happy to be of service. Ed, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Bruce, for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
It is my pleasure. Please take a moment or two and introduce yourself to our viewers.
Well, my name is Ed Daube. I call myself the emotions doctor. I am a licensed clinical psychologist in California, and I'm retired after about 32 years at the California Youth Authority, working with incarcerated young men and women. And since my retirement, my mission basically has been to educate people to all of the myths and misunderstandings about emotions, because there's a lot of them out there.
Thank you. Now, I've been thinking about this, and I cannot think of any animal, mammal, bird, insect, reptile, that doesn't have emotions. Why is emotion so fundamental to life?
It's an excellent question. And while I can't address invertebrates, I can say that a lot of our subhuman, if you will, animals like monkeys and so forth do have emotions. But let me explain why that's important. When we were cave people, we did not have sharp teeth or sharp claws. So in order to defend ourselves and ensure our survival, we developed emotions. So emotions enabled us to survive. And this is how the process works, Bruce. Even today, we are constantly scanning, all of us, our environment for threat. And when we perceive threat, the amygdala kicks in. That's the emotional part of our brain. And it sets up a threat warning. And it happens subconsciously. We're not aware of it, and it happens very quickly. And that, by the way, is why people think that their emotions control them. They don't. What happens is the brain controls the initial threat response. Now, when that happens, we automatically go into fight or flight. Now, the difference between us and our cave ancestors, is that we have developed the thinking part of our brain, of the cerebral cortex. And that enables us to evaluate, to assess the nature of the threat, which then gives us a choice. So we now have a choice on how we want to respond to the emotion. So the process is you perceive a threat subconsciously. Your brain alerts you to the threat physically, so you need to be aware of how your body responds to that, which means you need to be aware of what your body does and how it alerts you to the different emotions. Each emotion has a different message which tells you what the threat is. You then have to take a step. This is the emotional process, by the way. You then have to take a step back, take a deep breath, which lowers your arousal, and the step back gives you physical safety. You then can assess the nature of the threat. The first part of that process is what's called emotion management, where you're managing your arousal level. The second part of it is what I call emotional mastery, because when you master your emotion, you enable yourself to utilize that information to be able to interact with and move the environmental situation to your advantage. You can choose what you wish to do. Does that answer your question about why emotions are important?
It does. And even though I had to fix the alarm on my phone, which I hope nobody heard, I was paying attention. First, I want to say to any monkeys who might be listening that any letters of grievance should be sent to you, not to
Absolutely.
me. I will provide your contact information at the end. I know plenty of humans who I would rate below monkeys, so I do not endorse the term subhuman. But to be serious, I've read and I've had guests on the show previously, obviously, who have talked about how to cope with fear. And the bottom line is your brain creates all sorts of chemicals, and the way to the almost literal wall is built up in your brain, and you're all emotional and you can't think straight, meaning you can't be rational. And the way to knock that wall down is by taking a deep breath, because oxygen clears your brain. You can disagree. Is fear the most basic emotion?
Well, I don't want to disagree. I want to clarify.
Okay.
There are 5 primary emotions, depending on whose list you look at.
Okay.
There is mad, which is anger. There is sad. There's fear. There's surprise, and there's disgust. And those are the primary emotions that we have and have had since we lived in caves. Now, let me explain about fear, because what often happens is people fail to distinguish a difference between fear and anxiety. Fear is a primitive emotion, the message of which is there is a threat, and that threat will kill you. So when you experience fear, you'll know in your body where you experience fear. It's a very strong emotion. You want to validate all emotions, but in the case of fear, you want to act on it, because chances are your fear may be correct. And what I'm talking about here is an example. You are going to enter an elevator, and there's somebody in that elevator that looks fine and isn't doing anything wrong, but your body says, this guy's dangerous. It's better then to just take the next elevator. Now, some people say, feel the fear and do it anyway. What they're probably talking about is not fear, but anxiety, which is a different emotion. The emotion of anxiety is a future-based emotion, the message of which is there may be a threat, and that threat may kill me. It's not fear. Fear is a very primitive survival-based emotion. Anxiety is a different emotion. Anxiety is warning you that you need to assess the nature of the threat and decide what you're going to do about it. So when you feel anxious, the process to master that emotion is to then ask, what's the nature of the threat? What can I do about it? What can I do to ameliorate it, to prevent it, or to make it less? So when my students experience anxiety about a test, the smart ones will say, okay, what do I need to do? Well, the threat is I may fail the test. The process to intervene there is to study. When you study, you now are taking action to take care of the threat, and there's no more need for anxiety. That, by the way, is using anxiety as what's called eustress, E-U-S-T-R-E-S-S, as opposed to distress, D-I-S, which is where you allow the anxiety to totally mess you up and you take no action at all, and you end up failing the test.
You had mentioned emotional mastery. Did you just give an example of mastering emotions?
I did. And the idea here is to utilize the emotion, which tells you there's a threat, to then assess the match between your perception of threat and what's going on in the environment, and then to choose an adaptive response. That's an emotional mastery. That's using your emotions as tools to strategically intervene in your environment to your own advantage. so you can make adaptive decisions.
As an adult,
Yes.
I believe I have only cried 3 times.
Okay.
First time, not sure the chronology. First time was when my dog died.
Okay.
Second time, I had been in the hospital for 27 days having stomach surgery.
Wow.
And the IV was there for 27 days, meaning the
Ooh.
tape was there for 27 days. The IV didn't bother me. The recuperating from the surgery didn't bother me. I mean, it was painful, but
Sure.
I didn't cry. When I was discharged and the nurse came over and gently removed the IV and then ripped the tape off, then I cried. That hurt. All right.
Okay.
The third time, just to explain, I grew up in Canada. I cried when Queen Elizabeth died.
Okay.
Now, that's me. When you see somebody, and I've had what everyone would consider to be catastrophes in their life, and lost dear friends, and I was sad, but I didn't cry. It's not that I didn't care, I just don't cry.
Okay.
And people had a problem with my reaction. And I just said to them, I'm doing everything that you're doing except crying. I don't cry.
Okay.
So my question for you is, how should you read someone's emotions?
Oh, that's a very good question. Because the concept of emotional mastery helps you deal with other people. And here's how it works. If I perceive in you an emotion like anger or like sadness, I need to go through the same process. I need to say, what is the message of that emotion? The message of anger is there's a threat out there, and my anger empowers me to go to war with my anger and use the nature of my anger to overcome the nature of the threat. The message of sadness is I've experienced loss. Now, in your particular case, if I'm looking at you and you're expressing sadness, I have to be able to read how you express sadness. So if you're crying, that tells me that you're sad. And then I can say, okay, you are perceiving yourself as experiencing a loss. So then I can interact with you appropriately. If I'm looking at you and you are using anger as a secondary emotion, and that's a myth, by the way, that all anger is secondary, and it's not. Anger is only a secondary emotion when it's used to cover up other feelings. So if you as a man, and this isn't the case for you, but if you as a man can't deal with sadness and express anger because that's more empowering, then I'm going to respond to your anger, not your sadness. The crying in itself may or may not be indicative of sadness for you. You may express sadness in other ways, which I would have to learn by interacting with you. And sadness only comes about when the loss is so severe that it brings about that response. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Now you put together crying and sadness. Would you also put together laughing and happiness? Because I know of a lot of people, myself included, when there's an uncomfortable situation, we sometimes laugh.
That's very possible. So then what you're doing in that case is you're using laughter to cover over or to substitute, if you will, for the hurt. So in a sense, while that certainly is understandable, how do I want to put this? I want to say I want to say it's dishonest, but I don't want to imply that there's something wrong with it. It's only dishonest in that the crying is not displaying what you're actually feeling. Now, in that particular case, if I see you laughing and I respond to your laughter, as if that's expressing some sort of pleasure with a situation, you're going to look at me and you're going to say, what the heck's wrong with you, Ed? I've just lost my whatever. And you're coming on to me or interacting with me as if nothing's wrong. So I'm not getting what you're feeling, because what I'm seeing is not representative of what's actually going on in you.
This reminds me of poker. And
Okay.
for the record, I do play poker, but only online and not for real money. So no one needs to be concerned in that regard. I might be crazy, but I'm not stupid. You look in poker, they say you don't play your cards, you play your opponent.
Right.
And you look at, and what I enjoy about playing online is you can't see your competition.
Okay.
You see when they bet and if they're taking advantage of the fact that they have a lot of chips and things like that. A different way to find their what's called a tell. And I
Right.
know you know what a tell is.
I do.
So what's the difference between, or how important is being a good poker player, literally and figuratively, to interacting with people, reading their emotions correctly, and therefore not offending them and knowing how to work with them?
Extremely important. But what you're talking about is encompassed by the concept of display rules.
I don't know what that is.
I'm going to explain it. In our culture, we have rules that dictate, if you will, what's appropriate for women in terms of expressing emotions and what's appropriate or manly for men. And display rules often complicate the interaction. Years ago, I went online it was LinkedIn, and I went into a women's forum and I identified myself as a man, saying, what happens to you as a woman when you express anger? Bruce, I got over 2,000 responses that basically said, I, as a woman, cannot express anger because when I'm labeled a feminazi, or I'm labeled a whatever it happens to be, a bitch. I'm mislabeled and I'm demeaned and I'm marginalized. So I, as a woman, this is what the people who were responding to me, I, as a woman, cannot express anger in most situations, parenthetically, because men can't handle it. That's a display rule. The display rule for men is that we tend not to be able to acceptably express anxiety because that's perceived as weakness, sadness because that's perceived as weakness. So we as men tend to resort to anger because that's perceived as power, expressing power. So those are display rules. There are ways to get around that, and I've written about it, for women to be able to utilize the power of their anger, just not to express it outwardly. So you utilize the power of your anger to interact with your environment to achieve your goals. You just don't express anger directly if you in your environment are not allowed to do that. Now, for men, we have to learn how to be able to acknowledge and express, or acknowledge and be able to validate our sadness or our anxiety and utilize that, and then to decide if it's appropriate for us in an environment, if we're not going to be exposed to some negative consequences, then to decide if we're going to express it or not. So in terms of your question, yes, if you have a poker face, you're going to perhaps not get the response that you want from other people with whom you're interacting because you're not expressing your emotion directly. Does that answer your question?
I think it does. Let's move on because we have about 10 minutes left. How can we use our emotions strategically to better ourselves, better our relationships, personal, at work, what have you?
That's a very good question. The idea behind mastering your emotions as a strategic tool is to be able to utilize the information that your emotions provide for you regarding what's going on in the environment that you find yourself in, and to utilize that information to choose an adaptive response which works for you and for the people with whom you're interacting. So having said that, if I know myself and my body and how to be able to interpret the information that my emotions are telling me, then I now have the ability to decide if in fact the emotion is giving me accurate information, there is a threat in the environment that I need to act upon, or I've misperceived what's going on, in which case I need to step back and not act upon the emotion. So if I'm in a situation where I perceive a threat, I perceive you as a threat, rather than act upon that and attack you, I'm going to take a step back physically to create physical safety between you and me. I'm going to take a deep breath to lower my arousal level, and I'm going to say, what's going on? What did I do that led you to perceive me as a threat? What is it? Or if this, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. This is my interacting with you. But I'm going to question what's going on, that maybe I've misunderstood what you've done. The statement that you said came about because you misunderstood something that I did or said. So if I then can find out by questioning what's going on, taking a second look at it, I may let the anger go and not get angry at all. That's how you utilize anger or an emotion strategically. Now, if I perceive you being angry to me, instead of my interacting back to you, because what happens when somebody gets angry at you, they start out here, they're yelling, and I want to escalate, and I go, and there's an explosion. And that, by the way, is if somebody's yelling at you, Bruce, the way you respond is to whisper. And the reason why you do that is because when you whisper, they're up here yelling at you, and you're down here whispering. They have to stop, take a breath, to be able to hear what you're saying in order to be able to come back and respond to you. That's just a little technique that most people don't know about. But having said that, if I perceive that you're angry at me, I'm going to utilize that emotion strategically by finding out what the threat is that you perceive me as representing to you. If it's something I've said or done, I can apologize. Or I can interact with you in some other way that may diffuse your anger. Or I can acknowledge your anger. Again, if I've done something wrong, I can apologize. But that's utilizing the emotion as a strategic tool to give me information that will help me better interact with you.
It all comes down, I'm thinking, to the adage, you have to control your emotions and not allow your emotions to control you.
Yes and no.
Good.
Now, what I mean by that is this. The idea that emotions control us is a myth. And it comes about, as I've said earlier, because the initial emotional response is in fact unconscious, and there is no control. The emotion is dictating to us how our body responds or reacts to that. The problem with the idea that people think emotions control them is that it allows them to say, well, if I hadn't been angry, I wouldn't have attacked you, yelled at you, or whatever. And so enables them to utilize their emotions as an excuse to justify the inappropriate behavior that they've engaged in. So my approach says, no, your emotions don't control you. You have a choice to master the emotions and choose how you're going to interact with and respond to what's going on in your environment. The difference is that whatever action somebody takes based on the emotions that they're experiencing, they're responsible for that action, no matter what it is. If it's inappropriate, they're responsible for it. If it's appropriate, they're still responsible. I'm interested in getting people to acknowledge that whatever actions they take, they have to take responsibility for. The young women I worked with the Youth Authority, when I first got there, I had 5 young women who had killed their children. I was totally out of my element, Bruce. I had no experience with that in graduate school. Never in any of the courses or any of my practicums did I come across that as an issue. So my job was to help them understand that while they were not monsters, the actions that they took were in fact monstrous. So I needed to help them learn to master their emotions, including the way they viewed themselves and how they interacted with others. That's how I developed the Emotions as Tools model, by the way, working with these young women and working with staff who also didn't want to deal with emotions. So I had to come up with a metaphor that would help them explain what emotions were, tools, and how they could learn to master them, like you master any other tool, like a cell phone or a baton or handcuffs or your TV remote, which I'm still working with. That's why I have kids.
Now, you got me thinking about something, which is good. A woman kills her children.
Yes.
A normal person's reaction would be, well, what punishment would be severe enough in that case? Because she's going to have to live her entire life knowing that she killed her children.
Exactly.
But what if the person knows what she did, but doesn't understand to use your word, how monstrous it was?
Okay. Then in working with that person therapeutically, if she's going to be rehabilitated, if you will, then we need to help her understand how others perceive what she has done. Because in this particular case, as given the example you've given, she's not seeing it. She's only seeing it from her point of view, which is the only point of view she has. So she needs to be able to learn perspective taking, which is to put herself in somebody else's shoes and see how they view what she's done and how our culture says killing your children is never acceptable.
I'm reminded, and I haven't thought about this in a long time, and because of you, I'm probably not going to sleep well tonight.
Sorry about
I
that.
went to friends and I were going out, and I went to pick them up. I forget why. The car wasn't working, not important. And they had a small child, and they asked me if I had any problem bringing the baby. I said, no, not at all.
Mhm.
So we were going to a nice restaurant, and we checked, and the owner of the restaurant had no problems with babies.
Mhm.
And she was dressed to the nines, as they say. She picked up the baby, and the baby vomited all over her. Her
Okay.
nice, beautiful. And she went like this. And then she stopped herself. And she took a deep breath, handed the baby to her husband, the baby's father. He cleaned her up. She changed her dress, and that was all there was to it. And I said to him, is this a problem? Did we just see something that could be serious? And he said, no, she stopped. It's when they don't stop that's the problem.
Yep.
She could control the emotion.
Yep.
Agree?
No.
Okay.
Well, excuse me. Yes, she did control the emotion. In that
Yeah.
particular case, she controlled it.
Yeah. And he swore it never happened again. And it was funny. He asked me if I would babysit. And I said, yeah. And he said, I want you to give her a bath. I said, no, you don't. You want me to check her body so that I'll see that there are no bruises and that she's not being abused. And I said, okay, that's fine. Now, on that happy note, as I promised at the beginning, I am going to share your contact information. I'm going to thank you profusely. And my final question is there anything that I did not ask you that you wish I had asked you? And if I had asked you, what would you have said?
Well, if you had asked me, how can your viewers and listeners get more information about emotions? My answer would have been, you want to go to my website, theemotionsdoctor.com. I have over 225 different posts about all aspects of emotions. You want to go to the index tab in the upper left-hand corner of the website, and you want to check on the index tab, or click on it. It will give you a drop-down menu, which will give you access to all of my posts by category and by title. You then can click on the title that you want and go directly to the post. That's how you get current information about any aspect or any question you may have about emotions, and it won't cost you anything.
Ed, I want to thank you profusely. This has been informative, educational, and exactly the type of interview that I enjoy most. So I appreciate it.
I've had a good time, and I'm glad I was able to answer your questions and hopefully give some information that your viewers can utilize and benefit from. Thank you very much for having me, Bruce.
My pleasure. I'm Bruce Hurwitz. Thank you for watching. And as always, please stay focused on success.